Hello, my name is Nick Phillips. I'm a partner in the intellectual property team at Edwin Co. Today I want to talk to you about domain name disputes, which is an area where we receive an awful lot of inquiries, and I think it's also fair to say we've built up an awful lot of experience in that area. So let's start with the basics. What is a domain name? Well, put very simply, it's the text that you type into your browser to access a particular website. The address for that website is actually a row of numbers known as the IP address, but the domain name system, or DNS, converts the text into those numbers and takes you to the website. Broadly speaking, there are two different types of domain name. There are generic top-level domains, or GTLDs, and you can tell a GTLD by the number of characters to the right of the final dot. So 3 or more is always a GTLD. So the big 5 GTLDs, the big sort of 5 traditional GTLDs would be .com, .net, .biz, .org and .info. And then more recently there's been a real proliferation of new GTLDs. Some of those are reserved for particular industries. So for example, .aero and .law. Some are reserved for use by particular companies. So for example, .google and .apple. But the majority of them are for general use, general application. Then the second type of domain name is what's referred to as country code top-level domains, or CCTLDs. And again, you can tell when you're dealing with a CCTLD by the fact there are only 2 characters to the right of the final full stop or dot. An example of a CCTLD would be .uk, .ie, or .io. So domain name disputes. The domain name disputes we see can generally be divided into 3 subcategories. So the first category would be the sort of fraudulent or criminal use of a domain name. So this is use of a domain name which is in connection with a fraud or behaviour which is clearly criminal. An example might be someone who has registered a domain name, usually similar or the same as a company, and is then using that domain name to link to a mirrored or a copied version of that company's website, usually with slightly altered contact or payment details, with the idea that when someone places an order on that website, it takes your money, but obviously no goods or services are ever delivered. The second type of dispute that we see is really the use of a domain name for some sort of commercial advantage. A good example of that would be a company that registers the name or a name which is very similar to one of its competitors as a domain name, and then uses that domain name to draw traffic which would otherwise have gone to its competitor to its own website. So how do we go about resolving these different types of domain name dispute? So with domain names that are registered for a sort of obvious criminal or fraudulent purpose, quite often the best way is to go straight to a law enforcement agency such as Action Fraud, who will often have powers to get that domain name suspended, get the criminal or fraudulent action stopped immediately. It's also usually worthwhile going to the registry. So that's the organisation that control either the CCTLD or the GTLD. So in the UK, an organisation called Nominet control all of the .uk domain names, or to the registrar, which will be the organisation which has sold you that specific domain name and which is usually hosting the domain name. Now, either the registry or the registrar will have an abuse hotline or an abuse process which you can contact, and quite often they will suspend the domain name for you if it's obviously being used for criminal or fraudulent purposes. So with domain names that are being used to gain a commercial advantage, there's a few options. You can try to contact law enforcement. Generally speaking, law enforcement are not going to be very interested unless there's an obviously criminal purpose. Similarly, you can try to contact the registry or the registrar direct, but you're likely to find that the domain names they take action on through their abuse policies won't be covered. But more promisingly, there will be a dispute resolution process which you can take advantage of. So for GTLDs, the dispute resolution process is run by an organisation called ICANN and is known as the Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy, or UDRP. With CCTLDs, the dispute resolution process is run by the registry. So for example, with Nominet, they have their own dispute resolution process known as Nominet's DRS, Nominet's Dispute Resolution Service, and other CCTLD registries may well adopt the UDRP. Now, a feature of these dispute resolution services, whether that's the UDRP or whether that's Nominet's DRS, is that you pay a fee. For Nominet, that's usually £750. With the UDRP, depends a little bit on which provider you use, but classically it's $1,500 US, and that gives you the right to put in a complaint and get a fairly low cost, quick decision about whether or not that domain name should be transferred to you. The final option is court action, typically for trademark infringement or passing off. Now obviously court action is going to be more expensive and usually more time consuming as well, but it may well serve a purpose, particularly if the domain name registrant is a serial offender, serial register of abusive domain names, and for example, it's important to get an injunction against them. Equally, if the person who's registered the domain name is also committing some other kind of wrongdoing, so if, for example, they are selling infringing goods and services, as well as using a domain name which infringes your rights. So for the third category of dispute, the more difficult disputes, again, you've got a few options. Firstly, it's always worth looking at the UDRP or Nominet's DRS, and you need to work out whether or not you can fit the facts into what you're likely to get a result with those dispute resolution processes. Bear in mind that they're not really suitable for very complex, fact-heavy disputes. Second alternative would be court proceedings route, so trademark infringement, passing off. Again, you probably need to make a judgment as to whether commercially the domain name in issue really justifies that kind of time and expense. But thirdly, and very often the best option, is to try and look to do a commercial settlement with the domain name owner, either in parallel with a UDRP or Nominet DRS procedure, or in parallel with court proceedings, or as a standalone negotiation. So in conclusion, there are a number of different ways to resolve domain name disputes, a number of tools which are available to you to resolve these disputes. Which one you select is really going to depend on a number of factors, including so really making an assessment of the nature of the dispute. Secondly, getting a feel for how commercially important the domain name is to you and how much time and money you want to spend pursuing it. And then thirdly, having a really good understanding of the tools which are available to you to resolve these disputes. Now, at Edwin Co, in the intellectual property team, we have a wealth of knowledge of resolving domain name disputes. We've done a number of Nominet DRS complaints, UDRP complaints, and we're also very experienced at taking court proceedings for trademark infringement and passing off